Giant rancher found a young Apache girl hanging on a tree with a sign, "White man don't forgive." Under the merciless sun of New Mexico, Calder Wyatt rode with a slow, steady rhythm, dust lifting with every step of his dun mare. He had been trailing a lost steer for half a day, the print gone soft in the cracked earth. The silence out here was sacred, broken only by the faint creak of leather, the whine of wind, and the occasional call of a distant hawk. Calder liked it this way, alone, quiet, predictable. He was a man shaped by the vast, unforgiving landscape, his frame as solid as the mesa rock, his hands calloused from years of wrestling with a land that gave little and demanded much. He had built his life out here, solitary and self-reliant, carving out an existence from sun-baked dirt and stubborn will. He carried the weight of the sky and the silence of the wilderness in his very bones. But then he heard it, so faint it might have been wind, a sound like a breath that had forgotten how to breathe. He froze in his saddle, his head tilting, his heart slowing its steady drum. It came again, a whimper, weak and sharp, like a thread about to snap. A sound that tore through the comfortable shroud of his solitude, demanding attention. He dismounted quickly, his movements fluid despite his size, tying the reins to a gnarled dead limb of mesquite. With his rifle slung over his back, its familiar weight a cold comfort, he moved through the scraggly junipers and across the sun-baked boulders. Each step was deliberate, his senses heightened, the prickle of unease sharpening into a cold dread. The desert, usually so indifferent, seemed to hold its breath. He followed the faint sound, a ghost of a cry that seemed to be pulled from the very air, until he came upon a small clearing ringed by old cottonwoods, whose leaves, though sparse, rustled like dry whispers in the hot breeze. And there, beneath the oldest tree, he saw her. She was hanging by the wrists, her arms stretched cruelly above her, bound by ropes that bit deep into her skin. Her body hung limp like a broken doll, utterly without life or resistance, save for the shallow, erratic rise and fall of her chest. Her feet barely touched the dirt, stirring a faint puff of dust with each unconscious sway. Her skin was sun-dark and dust-covered, her long black hair matted with sweat and blood, clinging to her face in tangled strands. She was alive, miraculously, impossibly alive, a fragile flicker against the vastness of the dying day. Calder's eyes snapped to the crude wooden sign nailed to the tree above her head. The words were scrawled in thick red paint, angry and jagged, a stark, brutal declaration that seemed to bleed across the wood. "White man, don't forgive." He stepped back involuntarily, a wave of nausea washing over him, bile rising in his throat. The air thickened, heavy with unspoken malice, the ghost of violence clinging to the arid breeze. A warning, a message, a curse, all of it aimed at him, at his kind, at the color of his skin. He glanced around, scanning the ridges, the sun-dappled rocks, the distant shimmering heat haze. No movement, no sound, just the wind brushing through dead leaves like whispers, mocking his sudden vulnerability. His hand went instinctively to the knife on his belt, his fingers curling around the worn bone handle. "Christ," he muttered, the word a rough exhalation of breath against the raw horror of the scene. "What the hell did they do to you?" The girl stirred, barely. Her head lolled forward, and he saw the raw, angry burn marks where the rope bit into her wrists, chafing skin raw, the bone beneath likely scraped. He swallowed hard, the taste of dust and dread bitter on his tongue. "You hear me, girl?" he asked, his voice rough, hoarse with disuse and shock. No response, just that shallow, tortured breathing. "I am not here to hurt you," he said softer. Almost to himself, the words feeling inadequate against the enormity of her suffering. His boots crunched forward, closer, each step deliberate. He could see her face now, young, maybe 18, with a high brow and a strong jaw, her cheeks hollowed from thirst, her lips cracked and stained with dried blood. She was Apache, no doubt, the proud, defiant lines of her face etched even in unconsciousness. He reached up, his large hand dwarfing her delicate wrist, testing the rope. It was twisted mesquite fiber, harsh and old, the knots tight and unforgiving. Whoever tied it had meant for her to suffer, to linger, not just to hang. They wanted her despair to be a spectacle, a message. He pulled out his knife, its steel glinting dully in the harsh sunlight. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from a cold, righteous anger that began to simmer beneath his calm exterior. That sign, it screamed at him. White man, don't forgive. He heard echoes of things he never said, never did, accusations hurled from the collective memory of a brutal history. And yet it made him guilty, made him hesitate, made him question his own instincts. But then she groaned again, a sound so fragile, so utterly defeated, and that sound undid him. It broke through the years of hardened isolation, through the cynicism and the self-preservation that had become his second nature. "Hell with all of them," he whispered, the blade slipping into the tough fibers of the rope. "I ain't that." Witty. One firm, decisive slice, the rope gave way. She fell forward, a dead weight, and he caught her just in time, her body surprisingly warm, burning even with fever, and light in his arms, like she had no bones left. He eased her down to the ground, one knee in the dust, cradling her head gently as he propped her against the sturdy trunk of the cottonwood. Her eyes fluttered open, dark, frightened, unfocused, reflecting the dying light like shards of obsidian. Calder poured water from his canteen onto a clean folded cloth and dabbed her cracked lips, a stark contrast to the rough, desperate reality that had brought them together. "Easy now," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended, a gruff tenderness that surprised even himself. "You're safe, at least for the moment." She blinked once, then again, still no words, but her hand, slender and bruised, clutched weakly at his sleeve, a silent, desperate anchor. He looked at the sign one last time, the hateful words still stark, then at her fragility a powerful counterpoint to the violence etched on the wood. Then he pulled off his coat, the worn canvas smelling of horse and dust and honest labor, and draped it gently over her shoulders. It was too large for her, swallowing her small frame, but it offered a measure of warmth and protection against the cooling air. "You got a name?" he asked gently, already knowing the answer. "Nothing." Silence. "Guess we'll find one for you," he murmured, his gaze sweeping over her face, noting the delicate curve of her cheekbones, the faint tremble of her bruised lips. He stood, lifting her with surprising effort, cradling her like something precious, something not yet entirely broken. Her head rested against his chest, light as a feather, her breathing still ragged. "But for now," he said, the words a silent promise, "you're with me." And with that, Calder Wyatt, a man who had sought isolation for so long, stepped back into the wilderness, carrying a girl marked for death and a secret heavy enough to hang a man. The sun was dipping low by the time Calder reached his ranch, painting the sky in fiery hues that mimicked the violence he had just witnessed. It was just a modest outpost, clinging to the edges of a desert, too stubborn to forget violence, too vast to ever truly tame. A single windmill creaked on the edge of the fence line, its silhouette a familiar, mournful sentinel against the twilight. The old barn sagged like it mourned something lost, its timbers groaning under the weight of time and neglect. The house itself was simple, one room and a loft, its roof patched with old sheet metal, but it stood solid and honest, like the man who built it, a beacon of defiance against the relentless elements. He eased the girl from the saddle, her weight a fragile burden in his arms, and carried her inside. She was fevered, her small body burning, her head pressed to his chest, whispering breaths like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor. He laid her on the cot, the rough woolen blanket feeling impossibly soft beneath her, and unwrapped the coat, careful not to startle her. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, dark and wide and distant, but they watched him, unblinking, from the depths of her suffering. The lantern flickered against the rough-hewn walls as he poured water into a metal basin, the liquid shimmering in the dim light, and set it near her feet. He grabbed a clean cloth from a shelf, a faded piece of linen, and knelt beside the cot. Her legs were bruised, scraped, one ankle swollen, bearing the cruel marks of her ordeal. Rope burns marred her wrists like brands, deep red against her sun-dark skin. The sight twisted something cold and hard in Calder's gut. "I ain't going to hurt you," he said, his voice low and steady, more to break the oppressive silence than to expect any reply. "Just cleaning up a bit." He dipped the cloth into the warm water and wrung it out, the excess dripping back into the basin with a soft plink. Then slowly, reverently, he took her right foot, its skin grimy with dust and dried blood, and placed it gently in the basin. She flinched, just barely, a small tremor running through her body. He paused, waited, his hand hovering, ready to withdraw. When she did not pull away, he began to wash the dust and blood from her skin, his large hand surprisingly gentle, precise, like he was touching something sacred, something precious and fragile that might shatter at any moment. The water in the basin turned red and brown, a grim testament to her suffering. He worked in silence, the only sounds the soft splashing of water and the girl's shallow, ragged breaths. He was careful not to meet her gaze for too long, though he felt it on him, a silent, assessing scrutiny, like a blade drawn halfway, unsure whether to strike or fall. Her lips parted once, as if to speak, but no sound came, only a dry, rasping gasp. "Reckon you don't talk much?" he muttered, not unkindly, a faint, almost imperceptible curve to his lips. "That's all right. Silence is better than most things most days." He finished the first foot, then the other, meticulous in his care. She let him, her body still, but her eyes still watchful, a strange mixture of fear and dawning curiosity. When he was done, he wrapped them in soft cloth strips, improvising bandages for the raw skin, and set her feet gently on a folded blanket beside her. "You remind me of a river I used to camp near," he said quietly, almost to himself, the words drifting into the quiet room, an unburdening of a solitary thought. It was dry most of the year, looked dead, nothing but cracked earth and sun-baked stones. But after the rains, it ran fast and deep, carving new paths where there had only been dust. He paused, a flicker of memory in his eyes. Had a name, but the locals called it Quiet Snake. Don't know why, just quiet. He looked at her again, studying her features in the lamplight. Cheekbones sharp as ridge lines, lips cracked but full, dark lashes thick with sand and fatigue. She was young, too young for this kind of suffering, for the violence that had etched itself onto her skin. But there was something old behind her eyes, something that did not flinch from pain, only waited for it to pass, a weary patience that spoke of profound resilience. "I'll call you Lena," he said softly, testing the sound of the name. "Just for now, you look like an Elena, quiet but strong." She blinked once, slowly, a silent acknowledgement. No protest, no nod, just breath, just Lena. Calder stood, his hands wet and a strange ache in his chest, and reached for another blanket to cover her, tucking it gently around her shoulders, creating a cocoon of warmth and safety. Then he stepped back, giving her space, a privacy she desperately needed. "If you're hungry, there's beans," he offered, nodding toward the small cast-iron pot on the cold stove. "Not much, but better than air." Still no answer, but he didn't expect one. He grabbed his bedroll and dragged it toward the door. He would sleep out by the barn tonight. Give her the space. It was not right for her to be watched by a stranger, especially not one with blood in his past and questions in his eyes. He needed to respect her fragile sense of self. Before he stepped outside, he looked back one last time. She had shifted slightly, eyes closed, her lips no longer trembling. The basin still sat beside the cot, tinged with the color of what had been done to her, a silent accusation. He picked it up and emptied it outside, watching the crimson-brown water soak into the thirsty ground, dissolving into the earth, just as he wished the horrors of the day would dissolve into oblivion. Inside, Lena dreamed of fire, of horses thundering across open plains, of ropes cutting skyward, and of hands, rough but gentle, washing the hurt away without asking anything in return, a silent balm on her wounded soul. The days that followed passed with the slow, deliberate rhythm of desert life, each sunrise painting the mesas in hues of rose and gold, each sunset deepening the shadows. But the silence inside the house was different now, thicker, charged with something just beyond reach, a fragile tension that pulsed beneath the surface. Lena, as Calder still called her, ate when he brought food, though never much, her appetite minimal, her movements cautious. She moved with an innate grace, but her eyes were always alert, darting glances at every shadow, every sound. Her posture remained tight, coiled, like an animal who had been caged too long, perpetually braced for the next blow. She never spoke, never uttered a single word, but he caught her watching him when she thought he would not know. Otis, her dark eyes filled with an unreadable mixture of fear, suspicion, and a nascent curiosity. At night, Calder left her the cot, offering her the only comfort the sparse cabin afforded, and took to the barn, his rifle beside him, its cold steel a familiar reassurance in the darkness. He pretended it was to give her space, to allow her the privacy she needed to heal. But the truth was more complicated. He was afraid, not of her, but of what her presence meant. That sign on the tree still burned in his mind, its hateful message a constant phantom ache. White men don't forgive. Whoever wrote it had meant for her to die slow, to be a visible testament to their brutality. And whoever they were, they might still be coming, their vengeance unfinished. His solitary life had suddenly, violently, been exposed to a world he had long tried to escape. It was 3 mornings later, the sun already searing the land, when he first saw it, a boot print, slightly smaller than his, newer than his, and angled subtly toward the barn. Calder squatted beside it in the hard-packed dirt, his large fingers tracing the faint outline of the heel. Military issue, cavalry. The print was fresh, no more than a few hours old, a chilling testament to a trespasser's recent presence. He rose slowly, eyes scanning the ridgeline, nothing but sagebrush and heat shimmer, the vast emptiness suddenly feeling watchful, predatory. Back inside, Lena sat by the single window, still and silent, a small, dark silhouette framed against the harsh light. She did not look at him when he entered, but her body tensed, the subtle shift in her shoulders the only indication that she registered his presence. "You seen anyone?" he asked, his voice low, a warning barely concealed. She said nothing, only pulled the coarse woolen blanket tighter around her shoulders, retreating into herself. "I think we've got company," Calder murmured, more to himself, the words heavy in the quiet room. A cold knot tightened in his says. Tomach. His solitude was definitively broken. That evening he kept the lantern low, casting long, dancing shadows that flickered menacingly across the walls. He stayed by the porch, rifle across his knees, the familiar weight a tangible anchor against the rising tide of apprehension. The wind had died, leaving an unnatural stillness that pressed in on them. Coyotes howled far off, their mournful cries echoing across the vast expanse, and the stars blinked into view like watchful ghosts waking up, their cold light offering no comfort. Lena did not sleep. He could hear her moving inside, pacing the floor in slow, restless circles, a caged animal sensing the approach of its hunter. It was around midday the next day when the rider came, a solitary figure emerging from the shimmering heat haze on the eastern horizon. Dust curled behind the chestnut horse as it approached, a moving cloud against the brilliant blue sky. The man atop it wore the distinctive blue and gold of the U.S. cavalry. His uniform faded, but his bearing stiff and official. His rifle was holstered, his hat low, shadowing a jaw rough with stubble, a face hardened by duty and the merciless sun. Calder stepped down from the porch, his hand resting casually on his belt, his posture deceptively relaxed, every muscle beneath his clothes coiled and ready. The soldier reined in his horse, the animal snorting and pawing the ground, and squinted down at Calder, his gaze sharp and assessing. "You called Wyatt?" "Depends who's asking," Calder replied, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Lieutenant Graham, Dust Hollow Station. We're tracking a fugitive." The man pulled a folded, official-looking notice from his breast pocket and handed it down, his movements precise and practiced. "You seen this one?" Calder took the paper, his gaze falling immediately on the crude sketch. A young Apache girl, sharp eyes, long hair. He already knew what it would show, the image burned into his memory. Below the drawing, the stark, brutal words: "Wanted for murder and escape, dangerous. Reward, $500. A king's ransom in this desolate land." Calder looked up slowly, his eyes meeting Graham's, a silent battle of wills playing out in the sun-drenched yard. "Can't say I have." The lie felt heavy on his tongue, but necessary. "You sure?" the soldier asked, leaning forward in his saddle, his voice laced with suspicion. "Small, quiet, might be hurt, might be hiding. We think she was rescued or taken by someone passing near the Cottonwood Flats." The Flats, the exact place Calder had found her. A cold dread seeped into his bones. Calder held the paper a second longer, letting the silence hang, then folded it with deliberate slowness and handed it back. "Ain't seen nobody but jackrabbits and a cow that don't listen." His eyes were steady, his face an impassive mask. Lieutenant Graham narrowed his eyes, a glint of something cold and calculating in their depths. "She's not just a runaway, Mr. Wyatt. She's part of a violent group, savages." He spat the word out like a curse. "That sign they left, they mean it." Calder's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He knew they meant it. He had seen the sign. He had carried its weight in his mind for days. "If I see anything," he said, his voice clipped, "I'll send word." The soldier studied him for a moment longer, his gaze piercing, trying to find a crack in Calder's facade. Then he nodded once, a curt dismissal, and turned, his horse, spurring it into a slow trot. "See you do." Calder watched him ride off, the dust cloud slowly receding, until the figure and the horse disappeared entirely over the distant rise. Inside, Lena stood just beyond the curtain, a silent, watchful shadow. She had heard every word, her posture stiff, her face unreadable. She stared at him, unmoving, her dark eyes still wide with fear and suspicion. He stepped in, took off his hat, and leaned it against the door, the brim casting a deep shadow over his face. "They came looking," he said, his voice flat, devoid of accusation. "Showed me a paper, said you were wanted." She did not speak, her silence a familiar weight between them. "I told them, no." Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of confusion and suspicion warring with something else, something akin to surprise. "I don't know what you did, Lena," he continued, his gaze direct, unblinking, "and maybe someday you'll tell me. But out here, a man makes choices. I made mine." He turned to the stove, pretending to stir the beans he had already made for the evening meal, giving her space, allowing the words to settle. Behind him, she moved, barely a shift, a small, almost imperceptible breath. And in that moment, trust, a fragile, nascent thing, cracked the silence just a little wider, a ray of hesitant light piercing the darkness of their shared fear. The afternoon sun hung low, casting long, stark shadows across the yard as the relentless wind softened for a while, its constant whine fading into a gentle whisper. It had been a strange day, too quiet, like the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, an unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air. Calder sat on the porch, sharpening his knife with slow, rhythmic strokes, the steel blade kissing the whetstone. Each pass of steel on stone echoed faintly through the open, expectant yard, a small, persistent sound in the vast stillness. He focused on the motion more than the blade, as if the sheer repetition, the familiar grind, might keep his thoughts from drifting too far toward the woman sleeping inside. Or perhaps not sleeping at all. He paused, cocking his head, his keen ears picking up a faint, unfamiliar sound. The crunch of footsteps on gravel. Not a coyote, not a horse, something lighter, more deliberate, human. He looked up, his hand instinctively going to the knife he had just sharpened, his grip tightening. Lena was outside. It was the first time she had stepped beyond the threshold on her own since he brought her home, a quiet act of defiance, a tentative reclaiming of her own agency. Her bare feet touched the earth tentatively, like she was testing if it would still hold her, if the ground beneath her would betray her or welcome her. The woven blanket he had left folded at the edge of her cot, a simple faded thing, hung from her shoulders, trailing like a second skin, a comforting weight. She walked slowly, her steps uneven, still weak from her ordeal, but certain, purposeful, toward the far end of the yard where the barn stood watch, its weathered timbers silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. Calder set the knife aside, his movements slow, deliberate, not wanting to shatter the fragile moment. He watched her, his gaze unwavering. He looked smaller in the sprawling light, more fragile, a wisp of a girl against the immensity of the desert. And yet, something in the way she moved had changed. She was not escaping. She was reclaiming. She reached the bare patch of dirt near the barn, a place where the constant wind had swept clean all debris, leaving a smooth, undisturbed canvas. There she knelt carefully, her movements almost reverent, as if kneeling before something sacred, and let the blanket fall to her elbows, exposing her bruised arms to the setting sun. Her fingers moved with purpose as she picked up a gnarled stick, stripped of its bark, and began to draw in the dust. Only then did Calder rise. He walked over slowly, his boots quiet on the dirt, giving her space, respecting the unspoken boundary she had created. He stood a few feet behind her, watching her slender hand trace intricate lines into the earth. In the dirt, she had drawn a bird. Its wings were stretched wide, mid-flight, caught in a moment of desperate striving, but flames encircled it like a burning crown, consuming it even as it tried to ascend. The lines were bold and sharp, etched with a raw tension, a primal energy. The bird looked alive and in agony, its wings angled upward, as though trying desperately to escape the fire, or perhaps to rise with it, to harness its destructive power. Calder had seen war, seen symbols carved into rifles and burned into skin, crude marks of vengeance and belonging. But this was something older, something deeper, a cry, a prayer, a lament. He squatted beside her, his large frame settling heavily into the dust, his voice low and respectful, almost a murmur. "What's that?" Lena did not look up. Her face remained still, her dark eyes focused intently on the drawing, lost in the lines she had etched into the earth. For a long moment she said nothing, as if deciding whether or not to let the memory free, whether to break the long silence that had been her only protection. Then she spoke, her voice dry and cracked, like the riverbeds in midsummer, each word a painful effort. "Bird and fire," she said, "my people's sign." Calder remained silent, his eyes never leaving the powerful, disturbing image, letting her words hang in the air, a fragile bridge between their two worlds. She tapped the center of the bird with the stick. "This was my father's, our family. We painted it on tents, carved it on bows, on our hunting tools. Always flying, always fire. Calder could feel the tension in her small body, the way her shoulders pulled back, the tightness in her jaw, as if she were bracing for something, for the release of unspeakable pain. "They come, soldiers, white coats. Last spring," she continued haltingly, each phrase broken by the effort of dredging up the memory. "Say we must move far, dry place. No food, no water. Say we're danger." She paused, the stick in her hand trembling, the tip drawing erratic lines in the dirt. "We say no, we stay. We fight." Her voice thinned, becoming a whisper, burdened by the weight of what she was about to reveal. "They burn. Kill my mother. My 2 brothers burn. The old ones inside the tent." Calder clenched his fist slowly, his jaw tight, his own breath catching in his throat. Something old and angry stirred in his chest, a deep-seated fury at the casual brutality, the senseless destruction. "I run, hide," she went on, her voice gaining a desperate, almost breathless quality. "They find me, beat, tie me, call me thief, say I took rifle. I didn't." Then she turned, suddenly, fiercely, locking eyes with him full. For the first time, her gaze unblinking, raw with pain and indignation. There was fury in her voice now, a desperate, righteous anger that vibrated through the quiet air. "I did not steal, I did not kill, I did nothing wrong." Her voice echoed in the open air like thunder across dry land, a powerful accusation against the injustice she had suffered. Calder did not speak for a moment, letting the raw power of her declaration settle. Then his voice came, low but certain, a bedrock of quiet conviction. "I believe you." She turned back to the dirt, her body slumping, the stick falling from her fingers. Her hands fell into her lap, resting limply. Then her shoulders began to shake, tiny tremors at first, almost imperceptible. But then the sobs came, raw and unfiltered, tearing from her throat, a sound of profound, unbridled grief. She curled forward, arms wrapped around her knees, her long black hair falling like a curtain around her, shielding her from the harsh world. The pain was too big for her small body, and it poured out in waves, a torrent of suffering that had been held captive for too long. Calder stayed beside her, unmoving, his presence a silent anchor in her storm of grief. He did not reach for her, did not try to comfort her with empty words or platitudes. Instead, he reached out and pressed his hand into the dirt beside the flaming bird, palm down, fingers spread wide, his rough skin against the dust she had shaped with her grief, with her truth. It was not touch, not an embrace, but a testimony, a silent vow of solidarity. She felt it, the subtle shift in the air, the steady presence beside her. Eventually, her breathing slowed, the sobs subsiding into ragged gasps. She lifted her head, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her dark eyes swollen but clear. Their eyes met, unshielded, a moment of profound connection in the dying light. "You can call me Lena," she whispered, the words a gift, a tentative offering of trust. Calder gave a small nod, his voice like gravel and wind, rough but steady. "All right, then." A pause. "Lena it is." They sat together in silence as the sun slid behind the ridge, painting the western sky in streaks of bruised purple and fiery orange. The fire burned in the dirt, the image of the flaming bird slowly faded into shadow, but its ashes, like the truth, remained, an indelible mark on the land and on their hearts. That night, the wind whistled low through the rafters of the small cabin, a mournful song, whispering through the thin walls like a ghost remembering its name. Calder sat by the fire, boots off, shirt sleeves rolled, tending a kettle of beans that bubbled gently, filling the room with the earthy aroma of supper. Lena stood by the window, arms folded around herself, a sentinel against the darkness, watching the night settle over the vast, indifferent desert. The silence between them no longer felt like a wall, a barrier of unspoken traumas and mistrust. It was something gentler now, like shared breath, a comfortable companion in the vast emptiness. She turned suddenly, her movement fluid and decisive, breaking the quiet. "You want to know the truth?" Her voice was soft, barely a murmur, yet it vibrated with a raw intensity that commanded his full attention. Calder looked up, his spoon pausing mid-stir, a bean suspended precariously. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion, careful not to press her with words, allowing her the space to unburden herself at her own pace. She walked slowly to the sturdy wooden table, the O's, and Calder had built himself, and sat across from him, her posture upright, her gaze steady. Her voice was quiet but clear, each word carefully chosen, imbued with the weight of her past. "My father was a minor chief," she began, her eyes distant, lost in the landscape of memory. "Our band small, peaceful. We traded with settlers, even learned their God, their ways. We had rules, boundaries. We wanted to live." Calder listened, his face unreadable but focused, his gaze never leaving hers, offering the unwavering presence that had become his silent promise. "Full winter ago," she continued, her fingers tensing around the table's edge, white knuckles stark against her dark skin, "a white woman was found dead near our hunting ground, throat cut. Her husband said it was us." A bitter, mirthless laugh escaped her lips. "But it was not. She died because he killed her. Everyone knew, but they blamed us." Her eyes found Calder's again, direct and accusatory, not at him personally, but at the collective injustice. The soldiers came, not just them, ranchers too, town men with rifles and fear in their eyes. They said they were taking justice. She swallowed hard, the pain rising in her throat, thick and suffocating. "They burned our camp, shot my brothers while they slept. My mother died holding the prayer beads the priest gave her, a tiny, useless symbol against their rage. They left my father hanging from our council pole, desecrated." Calder lowered his eyes, his fists clenching beneath the table. The image seared itself into his mind, another wound in a landscape already scarred by violence. "They found me in a hollow tree," she went on, her voice raw, a choked whisper. "I was hiding. I had a knife, a small one, but they took it. Said I was planning revenge, said I was dangerous." She paused, the weight of the injustice pressing down on her. "They tied me, questioned me, beat me. Then they took me to that tree you found me on, hung me up like bait." "For who?" Calder asked, his voice a low scrape, barely audible above the crackling fire, but heavy with suppressed rage. "For the rest of us," she said, her voice rising slightly, a hint of defiance. "For anyone still alive and angry. For those who might seek vengeance." She stared at him, her dark eyes searching his, then asked softly, the question hanging suspended between them, fragile and profound. "Why did you cut me down?" He looked at her for a long moment, the fire crackling softly between them, casting their shadows long and dancing on the walls. The air was thick with unspoken histories, with shared burdens. "Because," he said, his voice flat, devoid of self-pity, "once I couldn't." Her brow furrowed, confusion in her eyes. "My family," Calder said, his voice now a desolate whisper, each word pulled from a deep, hidden well of pain. "Last spring, raiders hit our ranch. Apache, they said. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. The truth often gets lost in the dust and the blood." He paused, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames, seeing not the present, but the ghosts of his past. "I was out hunting, came back to ashes, to silence." His voice cracked, raw with memory. "My sister was 16. I heard her crying in the barn, a small, desperate sound, barely a whisper over the roar of the fire." He swallowed hard, the bitterness a familiar taste. "But I woo, as scared, terrified. I didn't go in. I waited for help, waited for the soldiers, for the town men, waited for someone else to do what I was too afraid to do." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, full of a raw, exposed vulnerability. She died before anyone came. The silence after that was different. Not empty, but heavy, thick with the weight of shared trauma, of unspoken understanding. Lena's breath hitched, a small, sympathetic sound. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "because you couldn't save her." He nodded, a single, definitive movement. She studied him, her gaze lingering on his face, tracing the lines of his grief, his unspoken regret. "If I had been white," she asked, the question sharp, probing the wound he had just exposed, "would you still have pulled the knife?" Calder stood slowly, his tall frame unfolding, walked around the table until he was in front of her. She looked up, searching his face, her dark eyes vulnerable, awaiting his answer. He reached down, his large hand cupping her chin gently, his fingers calloused from years of hard labor, but his touch was careful, measured, infinitely tender. "I don't love skin," he said, his voice rough but clear, infused with a profound, simple truth. "I love what breathes under it." Her eyes welled, glistening in the firelight, but no tears fell. She reached for his hand, her slender fingers closing around his rough ones, and pressed her cheek into his palm, a gesture of profound trust, of acceptance. And then, as if by instinct, drawn by an invisible thread, they leaned into each other, the space between them dissolving. The kiss was quiet, hesitant at first, a tentative exploration of lips and breath, then fuller, deeper, as if both had been holding their breath for too long, for a lifetime, and had finally remembered how to exhale, how to live again. Her hands, small and trembling, rested on his chest. His arms, strong and protective, circled her back, holding her close, grounding her in the present. The fire popped softly behind them, a gentle counterpoint to the fierce beat of their mingled hearts. Later, much later, they stood in the small kitchen, the candlelight flickering against the old wooden beams, casting long, dancing shadows. Their shadows moved as one on the far wall, a slow, intimate dance neither of them had ever learned, but somehow knew, a choreography of two souls finally finding their rhythm. Outside, the desert wind, for the first time in days, calmed to a hush, as if acknowledging the fragile peace that had settled within the cabin. Inside, something profound began to mend, a deep wound beginning to close, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning hope. The wind returned with the morning, gusting harder than usual, carrying the scent of sand and distant smoke. Calder felt it in his bones, a primal unease, something shifting in the vast, unforgiving landscape. He had lived long enough under the open sky to recognize the wait before a storm, even if this one came with boots instead of clouds. 3 days had passed since the kiss, since the words neither of them said aloud took root in the silence between them, growing stronger with each passing hour. Lena had begun to move more freely around the ranch, her steps lighter, her posture less guarded. She helped feed the animals, her gentle hands, soothing the nervous horses, swept the cabin floor, her movements efficient and graceful, and even laughed once, a soft melodic sound that filled the quiet house when Calder cursed the stubborn mule that refused to eat its oats. But the peace was thin, a delicate membrane stretched over a volatile reality. By noon, a trail of dust rose from the east, an undeniable sign of approaching danger. Calder stood by the fence, his jaw tight, rifle resting against the porch post, its cold steel a familiar, reassuring weight in his hands. 3 riders approached, local men in canvas coats and old hats, their rifles slung across their backs, their faces hardened by sun and suspicion. Their leader, a man named Joe Prescott, wore a tin badge on his chest that looked more self-appointed than earned, a symbol of self-righteous authority. "Wyatt!" the man called, his voice booming across the quiet yard as he dismounted, letting his horse stand unattended. Heard tell you might be harboring someone don't belong. His eyes, sharp and calculating, swept over Calder, then toward the house, a predatory gleam in their depths. Calder kept his voice even, carefully modulated, giving nothing away. You hear a lot of things, Joe. Don't make them true. Joe Prescott spat into the dirt, a contemptuous gesture. A girl. Apache. There's a reward. 50 cash, and the thanks of every God-fearing man west of the Pecos. He paused, his gaze narrowing, sizing Calder up. You come all this way for a rumor, Joe? Calder asked, a challenge in his steady gaze. Prescott snorted, a harsh, dismissive sound. We aim to check inside just in case. He took a step forward, his hand hovering near his pistol. The other two men shifted in their saddles, their hands near their weapons, their eyes fixed on Calder, ready for any move. The air hung brittle, taut with unspoken threat. I'm the only one lives here, Calder said, his voice calm, but with an underlying current of iron. Ain't no girl, just ghosts and goats. Prescott stared at him for a long moment, his eyes boring into Calder's, trying to read the truth in his impassive face. Then he gave a tight, frustrated nod. If you're lying, Wyatt, you'll burn with her. They rode off without checking the house, turning their horses sharply, the message clear. They would be back with more men and less patience. That night, Calder sat by the fire pit behind the barn, the stars hidden behind heavy, bruised clouds, the air thick with the scent of an approaching storm. In his hand was the crude wooden sign he had pulled from where he buried it, the hateful words, "White man, don't forgive," still faintly readable despite the fading paint. He stared at it for a long time, his rough fingers brushing over the jagged letters, feeling the cold weight of the prejudice it represented. Then he stood and carried it to the fire pit, his movements slow and deliberate. No ceremony, no grand speech. He laid it down among the kindling, a simple act of defiance against a legacy of hate, and struck a match. The flames rose slowly at first, tentative licks of orange and yellow, then grew stronger, hotter, conscious, fuming the words in a hungry embrace of orange and gold. The dry wood cracked and curled inward, twisting as if the hate itself resisted dying, as if the very essence of bigotry struggled to cling to existence. Behind him he heard soft footsteps. Lena. She wore one of his old coats, too large on her small frame, the sleeves rolled twice, swallowing her hands. She stepped beside him, her eyes fixed on the fire, not speaking, her face illuminated by the flickering light. But her presence spoke enough, a silent testament to their shared purpose. The flames danced in her dark eyes, reflecting something that looked like mourning for a past that was not her own, and something like profound freedom, a release from the chains of unspoken accusation. I should have burned it sooner, Calder said, quietly, his voice rough with emotion, watching the last of the hateful words disappear into the swirling smoke. She did not answer, but she moved closer, close enough for her shoulder to touch his, a subtle, comforting pressure. She gripped the coat tighter around herself, her fingers knotted in the fabric, drawing warmth from the flames and from his unspoken companionship. "Thank you," she said softly, the words simple, yet they landed like something sacred, a profound offering of gratitude and trust. He looked down at her, his heart heavy and alive all at once, a complex mix of sorrow for what had been and fierce hope for what might be. The fire burned low, embers glowing like dying stars, sending faint tendrils of smoke into the bruised sky. Above them, the wind, which had been so restless, slowed to a hush, as if the very elements were acknowledging the significance of this quiet, defiant act. And for the first time, since he cut her down from that tree, since he wiped the blood and dust from her skin, there was no sign left of what had been written against her, only heat, smoke, and the heavy, profound weight of what they had chosen instead, a choice for life, for connection, for a future where forgiveness might, against all odds, take root. The next morning brought no wind, just stillness, thick and unnatural, pressing in on the ranch like a shroud. Calder rose early, the first blush of dawn painting the eastern sky, and packed dry biscuits, jerky, and a canteen of water into the saddlebag, each item a practical preparation for an uncertain future. The air around the ranch felt tighter, more watched, a palpable sense of impending threat. He had seen smoke on the horizon, too steady to be a campfire, too widespread to be accidental. Word had spread, carried on the invisible currents of prejudice and fear. They were out of time. Lena stood by the fence line, her long black hair braided back, wrapped in the same coat she had worn by the fire, its worn fabric a symbol of the protection he had offered. Her face was calm, resolute, but her dark eyes held questions, unspoken anxieties about the journey ahead. "We have to go," Calder said, tying the final strap on his pack, the last preparations complete. "Tonight," she nodded, already knowing, her quiet acceptance a testament to her intuitive understanding of the danger. "There's land south of here," he continued, his voice low, sketching a map of hope with his words. "Past the border. Some say the Apaches still live free in the Sierra Madres, far from soldiers, far from signs, far from the white man's unforgiving laws." He paused, his gaze meeting hers, seeking her affirmation. "We can make it if we ride hard, if we ride fast." Lena stepped closer, so close he could see the soft flush on her cheeks, the pulse beating faintly at her temple. She reached for his hand and held it firm, her grip surprisingly strong, a silent promise. He looked down at her, his voice barely above a whisper, raw with a desperate hope he hadn't known he still possessed. "You'll come with me?" She pressed her forehead to his chest, her breath warm through his shirt, a silent gesture of surrender and trust. Then she answered, her voice soft but clear, deliberate, each word spoken in a patched, slow, and careful manner, imbued with profound meaning. "I want to live. I want to live as your wife." Calder closed his eyes, the words echoing in his mind, carrying more weight than 1,000 promises, a lifetime of solitary dreams coalescing into a single, breathtaking reality. He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, the smell of clean desert air and quiet strength, like it was the last thing keeping him grounded, keeping him from floating away on a tide of overwhelming emotion. By sundown, they were ready. 2 horses saddled, their meager belongings packed. The ranch was left behind, a quiet door left swinging gently in the evening breeze, a home turned to memory, offering no note, no fire, no formal goodbye. Only the stark emptiness of a place recently lived in, now abandoned. They rode through the desert, under cover of stars, the moonlight painting the ridges silver, guiding their way south. Lena leaned forward against her horse, her movements steady, practiced, almost instinctive. She did not ask what lay ahead. She only followed, her trust an unspoken act of faith. 10 miles from the border, the land opened into low scrub brush and jagged stone cliffs, a wild, untamed expanse. Calder scanned the horizon constantly, every shadow a potential threat, every rustle of wind a possible harbinger of danger. His gut turned tight, a cold knot of apprehension. Then the shot came. A sharp cracking sound that echoed across the desolate plain, tearing through the quiet night. Calder jerked in the saddle, a searing pain exploding in his side, then collapsed sideways, sliding hard into the dirt, the impact jarring his already wounded body. "Calder!" Lena screamed, her voice a raw cry of terror and desperation, leaping from her horse, a band. Owning her own safety to reach him, he clutched his side, blood already soaking through his shirt, a dark stain spreading rapidly across the fabric. "Keep going," he rasped, his breath coming in ragged gasps, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. "No!" she cried, her voice fierce, defiant. Another shot whizzed past them, striking the rock behind her with a sharp clang. sending shards of stone flying. From the ridgeline, two figures appeared, dark silhouettes against the moonlit sky, riders, their rifles raised, already aiming for a second shot. Calder groaned, pulling himself up, using his rifle as a makeshift crutch. "We have to move." Lena hooked her arm under his shoulder, trying to lift his large frame, her small body straining with the effort. "Believe me," he growled, pain lacing his voice, "I won't leave you." Through sheer will, driven by a desperate need for survival, they stumbled toward the nearby rocks, bullets cutting through the night air, kicking up spurts of dust around their feet. Calder's boots dragged behind him, each step an agonizing effort, but he forced one step after another, his vision blurring, his world narrowing to the pain and Lena's resolute presence. Every breath came wet, a sickly gurgle from his wounded lung. Somehow, miraculously, they reached a narrow gap between two towering cliffs, a hidden pass, a natural fortress against their pursuers. Lena half-dragged, half-carried him inside, pressing him to the cool, rough stone wall, her own chest heaving, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The shots faded behind them, the sound muffled by the stone, then ceased entirely. The riders would not follow through the treacherous rocks, not without losing speed, not without risking their horses and their own lives. In the deep shadow of the pass, Calder collapsed to his knees, blood dripping steadily onto the dust, forming a dark, expanding pool. He looked up at her, pain and wonder both in his eyes, a flicker of something akin to awe. "You said you wanted to be my wife," he rasped, his voice weak but clear. She knelt beside him, her hands cupping his face, her touch gentle, unwavering. "I meant it," she whispered, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, her love a fierce flame in the darkness. His lips curved into a faint, painful smile. "Then we better make it through this pass." She nodded, her resolve hardening, a silent vow. And for the first time since they met, since she had clung to him on that dusty trail, Lena prayed, not to the Christian gods of the settlers, but to the ancient spirits of fire, wind, and survival, to the ancestral voices of her people. Because love in this unforgiving place was always a gamble, a dangerous, beautiful wager, and tonight, under the vast, indifferent stars, they were betting everything. The tent flaps rustled gently in the cool river breeze, a soft lullaby, moonlight slipping through the stitched seams like silver threads, painting soft patterns on the earthen floor. Outside, crickets sang low, a chorus of tiny voices, and the water of the peaceful river whispered over smooth stones, a constant, comforting murmur. Inside, Calder lay propped on folded blankets, his breath slow but strong now, a steady rhythm that filled the small space. The fever had passed, a lingering ghost of his ordeal, and the worst was over, the wound in his side slowly, stubbornly healing. Lena sat beside him, a basin of cool water at her side, her movements gentle and precise as she gently wiped down his brow, a cool cloth against his skin. He watched her through half-lidded eyes, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly, a faint, contented smile. "You always this bossy with your patients?" he murmured, his voice still a little rough but tinged with amusement. She raised an eyebrow, a playful glint in her dark eyes, but smiled, a soft, radiant curve of her lips. "Only the ones too stubborn to die," she retorted, her voice light, playful. He chuckled, then winced as the laughter tugged at the freshly stitched wound in his side, a sharp reminder of their narrow escape. She hushed him gently, placing a palm over his chest to steady him, her touch a silent balm. The silence between them deepened, not awkward, not empty, but full, brimming with unspoken affection, with shared understanding, with the quiet miracle of their survival. Then, as the wind sighed softly outside, he spoke again, his voice softer now, touched by something raw and vulnerable. "Tell me something true," Calder said, his gaze fixed on her face, searching for a deeper truth. "What's your real name?" Lena looked down, hesitating, her fingers tracing an invisible pattern on the blanket beside him. Then she reached for his hand and guided it to her chest, just over her heart, a gesture of profound intimacy. "Ayana," she said, her voice a whisper, yet resonating with ancient meaning. "It means peaceful river. My father gave it to me." Calder closed his eyes for a beat, letting the name settle into him like a prayer, a profound revelation that flowed into the deepest parts of his soul. When he opened them again, there was warmth behind the weariness in his eyes, a depth of emotion he rarely allowed to surface. "Ayana," he repeated, tasting the word, letting it roll over his tongue, savoring its beauty. "You're the only peace I've ever known." She didn't cry this time. Her eyes remained clear, shining with a quiet joy. She only held his hand tighter, a silent, powerful bond forming between them, stronger than any words. Months passed. On the southern edge of the territory, where the border blurred into mesquite groves and dry wind carried the scents of sage and wildflowers, a small lodge stood near the river's bend. Made of pine and hide, strong but humble, it sat nestled amidst whispering reeds and vibrant wildflowers, a quiet haven carved out of the wilderness. In the dappled shade of its awning, Ayana, now truly Ayana, sat cross-legged, stitching a tiny white shirt, her fingers moving with quiet grace. Her belly had rounded gently, visibly now beneath her woven sash, a testament to the new life growing within her, a promise of a future blossoming from the ashes of the past. Humming quietly, a soft, melodic tune, she worked the needle through soft cotton, her fingers sure and calm, each stitch a testament to hope. Beyond the small garden, a riot of carefully tended native plants, Calder trained a young mustang, murmuring low commands, his voice patient and firm, his movements a symphony of strength and gentleness. Every so often he glanced back toward the lodge, catching sight of her silhouette through the light curtain, a familiar, comforting presence. And every time, a soft, unbidden smile touched his lips, a profound contentment settling deep in his chest. Inside the walls bore no trophies, no grand portraits, just bundles of aromatic herbs hanging to dry, 2 well-worn books, and a child's blanket waiting to be finished, each item imbued with the quiet warmth of a home built on love and resilience. Ayana moved through it like the very breath of the place itself, present, grounding, full of quiet life, a constant source of strength and serenity. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, she walked down to the river, following the same path she'd taken for months now, a path worn smooth by her barefoot steps. The current moved slow and certain, a timeless rhythm. She stepped barefoot into the shallows, letting the cool water kiss her skin, a gentle caress. She laid both hands over her belly, a gesture of profound connection to the life within. "Little one," she whispered, her voice soft as the rustling reeds. "Your father, he didn't just forgive, he loved, and he kept his promise. To everyone." Behind her, footsteps padded softly across the grass, familiar and comforting. Calder came to stand beside her, their fingers entwining without a word, a silent testament to their unbreakable bond. Together, they watched the river drift under the deepening dusk, its surface mirroring the first stars beginning to blink into view, tiny pinpricks of light in the vast canvas of the night sky. No one had expected 2 hunted souls, 2 individuals scarred by a brutal world, to find something like this, a refuge, a home, a burgeoning family. But somehow, in a world defined by scars and storms, they had created a quiet patch of earth where love had taken root, not the kind written in history books of grand gestures and epic battles, but the kind that endured, the quiet, persistent love that healed and sustained. And the river kept flowing, peaceful, like her name, like their life, like something finally, truly, profoundly home. If this story moved your heart, If it reminded you that even in the harshest deserts, love can bloom like water from stone, then this is the place for you. Discover more gripping tales of courage, survival, and love that defies all odds. Immerse yourself in the untamed spirit of the Old West, where forgotten histories rise from the dust, and humanity finds its truest form. Subscribe now to West Have Rise on YouTube. Click the link below to join our community and never miss a heartbeat from the Wild West. Don't just read history, experience it.